As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission, I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain, keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, lights, camera, action, I'm ready to go. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Harry, good morning, and thank you, everyone, and thank you for listening. We're listening to Zach Carter, and I was just thinking we're meeting and seeing and speaking and communing this morning with Yarrow Dunham, director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. But I was just thinking, Yarrow, in terms of that song, it's no kind of hip-hop teenager song, but really it could be an elementary school rhyme. I mean, in terms of kids learn that fall down, you get up. You fall down, you get up. So it could be inspirational. It might have cross purposes. I've never really thought about it in terms of being addressed to the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, but we're going to talk about 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And it just dawned on me that's my theme song for the last year. And I think this has relevance about how do people kind of respond, regardless of their age, to the pitfalls and depression and just obstacles and just feeling kind of down. We got to get up and wash ourselves off. And so hopefully we get up, and even sometimes people might help us get up. And so we're going to talk about social development and from a cognitive standpoint, and particularly in terms of how it impacts 3, and 4, and 5-year-olds. And again, this is the Tom Ficklin Show, and I have the pleasure of having Yarrow Dunham with us. He's the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. By the way, Yarrow, good morning.
Good morning.
Do people say lab or laboratory or laboratory? I just wondered because I know you travel and you're international, and you're so laboratory is sometimes thrown in there.
Not so much. We try to keep it to lab. We don't want to give the impression of electric shocks or complicated apparatuses, which we don't use. We try to keep it light and friendly. Right. It's a child friendly place. Indeed.
And so we're going to plunge right in. And Yarrow was kind enough to kind of reach out to me last week in terms of some additional resources that are coming in a research project he's working on that really has, in my mind, seminal importance and kind of significant importance for what we're about as a society, as a civilization, and as a world. So with that kind of lead in, you got 48 minutes to kind of make me be either prophet or a liar, but hopefully it'll be more on the predictable scale of truth and justice and honesty. So Yarrow, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. It's great to be back on the show. Thanks a lot, Tom. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about this new project.
Would you please jump right in?
Yeah, maybe just to back up one step and just say a little bit about what my lab does and what the kind of goals of our research programs are. And this is a big group now of me, several PhD students, a bunch of really talented Yale undergraduates, some postdoctoral fellows. So really a large group of us. What we're really most interested in is understanding some of the ways in which we as humans are such richly social species. I mean, it's not an accident that solitary confinement is a form of torture, because what is it doing? It's ripping us out of the social networks that we use to make meaning in the world. And this process, one of the ways in which we make meaning is by thinking of ourselves as belonging to communities or to groups, right? And that can be really local things like your workplace, but it can also be these broader things like a racial or ethnic group, a gender or sex identity. It can be a national identity, a political identity. These ways in which we attach ourselves to groups. And what we're learning is that children from a surprisingly young age are thinking of the world as clustering into groups in this way. So certainly by age 3 or 4, kids are trying to kind of figure out who their tribe is. They're looking for their people, and they're taking lots of cues from the grown-ups around them to kind of get a sense of who are they, who are their people, and what does it mean to be a member of that group. And so really trying to understand those processes. Those are the big picture questions that we're tackling.
Tremendous. That's an evolving picture and a multi-dimensional picture as well. So therefore, you're here today?
Absolutely. So I was recently very fortunate to, along with 4 really talented colleagues all over the country that I'll say a little bit more about, have a grant funded by the National Science Foundation of the United States to really do some basic research on this kind of social development of children in the kind of 3, 4, 5 age range, maybe especially age 4 and 5, to think about essentially gender development and also kind of racial identity development. So to say a little more about what we mean, kids at these ages are starting to get ideas about what it means to be a boy or a girl, and whether that might be good or bad, or what activities might be appropriate. And some of this are things we may want to resist a little bit, because we don't necessarily want our children to hold incredibly strong stereotypes. We want them to believe in some flexibility. But the first step is to really understand, how do kids approach these sorts of decisions? And there are similar things going on around kind of racial or ethnic identity development, where, young boys and girls are starting to get some sense that they are themselves, say, white or black or Asian or Latino or what have you, and trying to figure out what that means and how that positions them in the broader world. So this is an old area of study, but a really unfortunate thing is that the large majority of the research that's been done in this area has looked at primarily white middle class or wealthy children. And the reason for that really is just the way in which this research usually is conducted. So I have a lab here on the Yale campus, and we have a database of really generous parents who have agreed to be contacted by us and invited into the lab. But if you think about that kind of structure, the kids we can usually enroll in our studies are the kids whose parents can bring them into the lab, say 10 a.m. on a Monday, on a time right around now, or 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. And if you think about who has the flexibility in their lives to do that, it often turns out to be more affluent families. And those, of course, in many parts of this country have other correlates in terms of who those people are, in terms of their, say, racial or ethnic background, but of course here mainly their economic background. And that means we end up not really enrolling children and families that really fit the diversity of New Haven, let alone the United States more broadly. So this new project is with researchers at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, Cal State Long Beach in Southern California, University of Washington in Seattle, and Durham, North Carolina, a researcher at Duke University.
So we'll have to have shows there as well. I love those locations.
Absolutely. And so what we're trying to do is, in all of those different locations, really trying to enroll a really diverse group of children into these studies. This is going to include children sort of East Asian descent, so American children of East Asian descent, Latino American children, African American children, and white American children in this sort of key age range at which kids are really getting interested in kind of social identity. And we want to have those children at least represented from these different regional areas as well, where growing up as an Asian, as an East Asian child, say, and Honolulu is probably very different than growing up in Southern California and so on. So in addition to just kind of racial and ethnic variation, regional variation, where kids have different exposures to diversity, different kind of experiences with members of other groups, different parental socialization practices. And so this issue of just making a more inclusive research is something that I think people are getting increasingly committed to. And it's probably important for anything, but if you study maybe something like basic vision development, it's probably a little less important, because we could probably assume that at least more or less basic visual processing is the same across children of these different backgrounds. But if we're thinking about how they think about, say, race or gender, it just seems pretty obvious that there's likely to be differences, which we can talk more about, across families and across regions where the environment and the situation is very different. And so unfortunately, we now have a situation where much of what we know about early kind of thinking about groups and children comes from this very restricted sample. So I would say our big goal is to really create a much bigger sort of base of evidence.
So you're providing an opportunity for parents and children to get involved.
Absolutely.
With radio, it's kind of, although I know people are dedicated in whatever they do and they drop it and listen for from 10 o'clock to 10:48 and stop driving in their cars and they stop working. But if someone has to kind of go and can't listen to the show in its entirety, how should they reach out to you in terms of if they're interested in being recruited or sharing the word? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a pretty nice website at socialcogdev.com. That's socialcogdev.com. Social Cog Dev for social cognitive development. So at socialcogdev.com, you can learn a bunch more about the whole research team. And there's a little link you'll see in the upper right about getting involved for parents or also for school officials, for principals or teachers who are interested in potentially seeing if they can work with us. And you'll get to some more information, a frequently asked questions where you can learn more about what's involved. But the really short version is we're really excited to both enroll families as well as schools and institutions.
And schools and institutions.
And we'd be focusing on research on the children, but we also always want to sort of get some information from the parents as well.
Boy, that's fascinating. So daycare centers and early child development centers.
Absolutely. And you'll also see on the website a bunch of schools in the area that we do have established relationships with, some that we've been working with for years and have a really nice relationship, and we can go visit the schools, and we send home, letters to the parents so they know what's involved and can make their own kind of informed decision about whether to take part.
Boy, tremendous. Again, this is the Tom Ficklin Show, and if you've just tuning in, Yarrow Dunham is with us, the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab. I won't say laboratory lab at Yale, but it's also, and definitely go to the website, but this new project that he's involved with in research project and really endeavor and just a passion that he's involved with, which also has kind of national corollaries, is something that I really was glad when you reached out to me that we could kind of share with folks. People, when we hear lab or even the short version of laboratory, obviously people say, what does this mean? Am I going to be a guinea pig kind of thing? Walk us through a little bit, if you could, what the commitment might be, or even, because I think people want, in terms of full transparency, that might be of interest to folks.
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing to say is just getting in touch with us and kind of getting on our list is no commitment whatsoever, other than just knowing that we may give you a call at some point and see if you're available to come in. For this particular study, though, the commitment is really very small. It would be coming into the lab. If you're a parent, it would be coming into the lab, maybe one afternoon or on one occasion. We also can sometimes do weekends and evenings to make it, more accessible. And coming and visiting. And the lab is set up to be really fun for kids. There's some toys. There's a waiting area. And then we would take the child through this little set of basically sort of a very structured interview where we ask questions about their views and beliefs about other kids who might vary along racial or gender lines in various ways. And there'd be a little simple survey. It would just take a few minutes for the parents to fill out as well about, who does the child spend time with and whether they as a family talk about issues around race and gender or not, or to what extent, just to kind of flesh out the family environment a little bit. And it would be really just this sort of one-shot experience. We would hope, though, that you would stay involved, that if you enjoyed the experience, we always have other research projects going on these and related topics. And we have a lot of families who have been coming, whose children have been coming in since they were babies into the Yale Infant Lab and have now, even at age 8 or 9 or 10 are still coming in. So they've really been kind of part of our community family in this way.
And that initial, and I appreciate you sharing that initial exposure that you referenced, an hour, 2 hours?
Really only about a half hour, 40 minutes maybe. So really kind of one visit. We always try to make it really fun for the kids. They get to take away a little toy or something at the end, and so that's.
So it's pretty much, is it exclusively verbal reporting, or do they play with toys, or do they look at videos?
Great question. Yeah, a little bit of both. So a lot of it. So there are this particular sort of set of tasks. There's some verbal reporting where we ask them some questions about who they might want to play with, or who they think might be kind of more likely to be in charge of who else. But then we also have some other questions, other activities that are set up more like games. So we have one where they have a little allotment of little cute erasers that they can give out to other people, other children that are depicted with little photographs. And we have another task where they imagine that they are someplace like at school or in the cafeteria or at the park, and there's a child sitting on the bench and there's a bunch more seats, and they can decide how close they would want to sit to that child. They think of this as a measure of kind of social attraction or social distance. Do they really feel like they want to approach that person, or do they more want to avoid that person?
And can you tease us? Because that being, wish I could be. I guess if I went in and said that I'm 3, you might not believe me. So, but any other example? I mean, those are really vivid examples, which I like.
Examples in terms of the kinds of tasks that we undergo and that we do and things? Sure. So there are some other tasks. Because we're really interested in these kind of basic cognition, another task is essentially a face memory task. So you just see an individual, a photograph of an adult on the screen. That photograph then disappears. And after a very short delay, 2 photographs come back. One is the same individual and one is another individual. And we're just seeing how good are children at recognizing people. In particular, people they may not be from their same gender or of their same racial or ethnic background. Because, this is really getting into, we've all heard these sort of phenomena going all the way up to adults where someone might say, oh, but don't they kind of all look the same? People never say that about their own group, if you notice. They say it about some other group. And we're kind of looking at the really early origins of this. Are kids better at recognizing faces that are drawn from groups that are more familiar to them? And if so, why might that matter?
Fascinating. Again, this is the Tom Ficklin Show, and Yarrow Dunham is with us, director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab. If you have to go, although I know you're going to stay till 4:45, how can people reach out to find out more information and or join or get involved?
Absolutely. So the website is socialcogdev.com. The word social, socialcogdev.com, and there'll be a link there about getting involved. You can also, if you Google search for me, you'll find my name and my email on the Yale page. It's Yarrow Dunham.
Well, if we go to the FBI, your FBI file, is that? Oh, that's probably.
I was raised by hippies in Berkeley, so who knows? Something might come up there, but I hope not.
And I make a bad joke in that regard, but we hear so much about the surveillance. Just as a sidebar, the surveillance society, and in a way, Yarrow, not to put you on the spot again, and you can handle these questions. There's a concern about where society is going and how people are being programmed, either by the media, programmed by the food that we eat, programmed by automated cars, just our conditioning just in living in this artificial intelligence. We hear a lot about that. So it seems to me you're at a very pivotal situation in terms of working with our earliest citizens, or our earliest world citizens, about how they're going to grope, grasp, deconstruct, construct, research, imagine, and participate in the world as they see it early on. So it's really, I guess the word that comes to my mind is it's a very sensitive and extremely sensitive and delicate endeavor that you're involved with.
Yeah, it certainly can be. I mean, the way that I think my colleagues and I tend to think about it, though, is we as adults, we don't sort of spring fully formed into existence at age 18, you know, the age at which a lot of research begins. A lot of the research done on these kinds of topics is with college undergraduates who maybe have to participate in a study to get credit in their intro psych class or something like that. But the attitudes and beliefs that they have are the result of a long developmental history that starts at least at these young ages. And so if we ultimately want to create a more inclusive, a more just, a more open society, I think that we really need to be looking at how minds get closed early on.
Fascinating. Share with us, again, we're going to come back to the particular research project and other research endeavors that you're involved with and how the community can participate. But you were involved with, we hear this term, maybe 4 years ago you'd hear occasionally implicit bias and explicit bias. Maybe 5 years ago. 4 years ago you'd hear it maybe once every 2 months. 3 years ago, once every 3 months. Now it's 5,000 times a day.
Yes.
Not only hearing the word, but in terms of money being allocated from the federal government, from foundations in particular, from individuals, and people also making money off of providing. It's become an industry, this explicit, implicit bias issue. And you've been involved, just as a backdrop, and another really joy of having you here. You've been involved with kind of the embryonic stage of this research. Is that correct?
Certainly, I've been involved with it for a long time, and one of my really close mentors when I was a graduate student myself is a woman at Harvard, Mahzarine Banaji, who's really one of the people most identified with this line of work and has done really amazing work on many aspects of implicit bias as well as explicit bias, certainly not confining oneself to that. So yeah, I would say I do have a long history with the area, and you're definitely right that it is really exploded into the kind of public consciousness in some way, and to the point where now there's actually substantial pushback where people say, well, maybe we're making too big of a deal of it.
Indeed.
And we can talk more about that. There are a lot of avenues or pieces of it, some of which I think have more merit than others.
The reason I raise it in this conversation, because it seems to me that your research down the road could also become a public policy controversy, if you will.
Interesting.
That's where I was, and not to say that the controversy regarding explicit and implicit bias is not worth having the civic discussion and the pushback, because we believe in dialogue and seek the search for truth. And one day the world is flat, the next day the world is round. Although you might get hung up, you might get hung or burned at the stake for saying that. So it's the politics of research is what the ongoing, that you're not just operating in a laboratory solely, particularly once you publish your research and have to defend it, et cetera. So
yes, absolutely. And anytime, especially where you need federal funding for your research dollars, or the money that supports research and that pays to keep the lights on and hire staff and all of that, you are just inevitably you're involved in politics. Yes. And so I certainly have colleagues whose research has been criticized by congressmen who feel that it's I think usually, and from my opinion unjustly, but who think that it might be politically motivated in some way. And I think one way to think about it is just by virtue of trying to study the kind of racial and ethnic development of children, you are signaling that you think that that's an important topic and that you think it has important, ramifications, implications for our whole country, such that tax dollars should be spent on it. And people can have different views of that, I think, and it can come under criticism for that reason. That it is sort of signaling, and often will be associated with more liberal priorities.
Indeed.
Or something like that.
So are you prepared to go on MSNBC and Fox News. I mean, if Bill O'Reilly was still on, had his show, he'd probably be reaching out to you tomorrow. All jokes aside,
yes,
but
right.
But you still may even get some calls from Fox News or MSNBC or CNN.
Mm. Yes, it certainly can happen, and we do occasionally get contacted by the media. I would say so far, I guess, luckily, it's mostly been what you might call sympathetic media sources, people who are just interested and want to tell the story of what we're working on. But every now and then you might get contacted by someone else. And I think one of the things that's challenging is we as academics are not necessarily really well trained. And even what we're doing now, we kind of pick it up as we go along. And going in, I would have to really prepare myself to go into the sort of lion's den, as it were, of a Fox News, of a Bill O'Reilly style thing, where I would go in there very much expecting that there was an agenda that was going to be, that they were going to attempt to impose on me, that I would have to be ready for.
Talk again. You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show, and Yarrow Dunham is with us, the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. Yarrow, talk to us about. I want to phrase this correctly. The outcome and the benefit. We hear so much, particularly in terms of since the establishment of this institution here in New Haven in 1701. Research for purpose of research only, and not with any translation of it in terms of community benefit, and or even when you engage in a research project, you have some idea of what you might, generally some paradigms that you might find or not find. And then lastly, I guess the kind of the third question is, we hear so much about race being, and correct me if I'm wrong, race just being a social, a construct, it's literally an imaginative idea. But you're suggesting that even these imaginative ideas that have no biological substance, still we perceive them to be real. Am I being too philosophical, or do you follow what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I definitely follow that. Maybe I'll start there, and then we can jump back to the prior ones.
Okay.
This has in fact become another kind of broader area of research in my lab, is this idea of that we socially construct all kinds of things in the world. We socially construct things like races and ethnic groups and religious groups. We also socially construct things like money and identification cards. These are real things that have real power in the world, but people created them. And for it, if you think about, I always like to try, to the best of my ability anyway, to take the perspective of that 3 or 4 year old looking up at the world. And they simply, of course, are not going to know the kind of complicated history of, say, race in America over the last couple hundred years. They are only picking up the signals that the environment and that the adults in their environment provide for them. And when they begin to hear adults using words to denote groups, so using, say, the language of race or of gender, or I think right now, as the father of a 2-year-old, I'm constantly noticing how hard it is not to use gendered language when I talk to her. So I have a daughter, and just to say, just the fact that I have to use her or she or I'm pointing out her gender constantly, even in contexts in which it doesn't matter. And I think what we think is going on is, it might not matter to us, but for a young child trying to figure out what's going on in the world, the fact that when we speak, break people up into male and female constantly, that's a signal for her that this is really, really important. So they're picking up cues from their cultural elders. And if they start, and as they get a little older and they start to learn, say, that maybe my daughter is likely at some point in the next year or two to come to realize that she is white, or is at least, is described as white by people around her. She has to try to figure out what that means. And that's going to involve looking at the world around her and looking at who interacts with who and how people cluster into groups. And does it look like it's a smooth and comfortable interaction, or do people occupy different social roles? And so she's trying to build meaning from this very difficult space.
Yes.
And unfortunately, some of the places she's going to get with that, if we don't work on it, could be negative views of groups that maybe tend to occupy, say, lower status positions in our culture. And so
Yes. That's really, really helpful. And the pleasure of speaking to is your honesty and your transparency. Obviously, you're on Facebook Live so people can see you, but also you're addressing points so head on. Are you blaming? And again, my role is not to be a provocateur, but also to hopefully stimulate. You're blaming adults for racism?
Okay, so that's a very complicated question. I mean, certainly,
you'd expect no less from me.
Of course, Tom. Yes, I know. So certainly, race itself is this historical, construct that we have that's very deeply embedded in many cultures, and kids are learning about it primarily from adults. So in some very direct sense, I would say certainly most of what kids are learning about race is coming from the adults and from the broader culture around them. What I would probably, though, the nuance that I would want to add to that is that while race in particular is something I think that is transmitted from parents to children, or the understanding of or views about, including prejudice and stereotypes, are often transmitted from parents to children, the broader sense of thinking about the world as having groups in it, and children having an intuitive idea that it's not just that they're groups, there are some groups that are my groups and some groups that are not my groups. This idea of us and them. I think that is as close to natural as something is for our species, that we're on the lookout for our tribe, our people, our community, and that implicitly involves other people who are not.
Okay, so a lot of evolutionary biologists suggest what you've just mentioned.
That's right.
So from an evolution standpoint, you're hoping that your lab might, in 2050 or 3000. I mean, I like that. As a sidebar, it's my this is my birthday week. I won't say how many generations or decades I've been around, but a few solar returns, and I'm taking the liberty, Yarrow, of just really just brainstorming and reflecting on what life might be after I leave here, whenever that might be, and just watching a lot of. We hear this term of dystopia versus Afrofuturism, so there's a lot of discussion about where the world is heading, separate from what's going on in the debacle in D.C. But you're suggesting that your intervention has more of it's more than just, well, not to say that finding a vaccine was not important, or not to say that Jonas Salk was not important, but from a historical and preservation of our civilization, you feel you have a part to play in that.
I think so, absolutely. And just to say, if you'll allow me just one little sort of personal note, when I first was in graduate school as a PhD student, the first area of research I did was on a very different topic. It was looking at how the language we speak might affect the way in which we think about the world. So you've heard about these ideas of what happens if some group in Alaska has 100 words for snow? Does this change their way of snow? So I was doing research broadly speaking in that world, and it was intellectually fascinating, but it always felt quite a far remove from sort of more pressing issues in our society. And one of the reasons I changed course a few years into graduate school was I wanted to ask questions that are both really interesting as basic scientific questions, but that also that you can imagine getting out there in the world and doing something positive, something that accords with my other values, my values beyond my values as a scientist, which is largely about, trying to do rigorous, open research that everyone can look at and evaluate and so on. And so I shifted gears to this other area. And that really comes back, I think, to one of the other questions that you asked me that maybe slipped through the cracks there, is that I really firmly believe that if our goal is to intervene on the way in which something like prejudice develops, right, then we really need to understand the mental processes that lead this to happen. I mean, I think that there are, in other words, we don't want to spend all of our energy trying to change something that isn't the right thing, that's not the right thing, that's going to have an effect down the road. So the basic science part for me often comes first. Let's understand how this mental system of a child's mind, how this system works, and what are the sources in their environment that are leading them to develop, say, more prejudicial or less prejudicial ideas. And then that can be the basis of some kind of intervention. That can be the base. We can give children the kinds of information or experiences that might, in some sense, you mentioned vaccines. One way we sometimes think about it is, are there things we could do to kind of inoculate children against the development of this most rigid form of us and them thinking, or that can remind them to think of others as also members of a broader group of, say, a group of Americans or a group of humanity. If we can encourage ways of thinking that promote that more inclusive mindset, maybe we can inoculate children against the kind of emergence of prejudice and ultimately discrimination, racism, and other forms of social injustice. So that's obviously the most laudable, that's the side of our sort of biggest, highest order goal that who knows if we'll ever accomplish, but that's certainly there. Absolutely.
Start on the path. And so you're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show, and Yarrow Dunham is here, the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. Yarrow, just for someone that might be tuning in, you referenced earlier that community groups, individuals, parents, institutions, early child learning centers, daycare centers, ministers, I mean, just it's a broad scope of how you're expanding your net, not only here in New Haven, but also in the other cities you reference, and we'll mention those cities in the Facebook Live and we have various ways for people to access the show. But share and repeat, if you would, how folks can kind of get involved regardless of what particular hat they might be wearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So our broad goal is to enroll a really kind of a diverse and representative group of families from the New Haven area here. That's sort of one of the goals of my lab, and just to make sure that we're really including people that represent the, the really great diversity of this area. And to that end, we're looking to get into contact with parents, with, as you said, ministers, people who work with or run schools, preschools, daycare centers, after-school programs, summer camps, places where children gather, and that would be open to us coming and sending some information home to parents to see who might want to get involved. So if you are interested in learning more or just having a conversation with me about this and how you might be able to get involved, the easiest thing to do is to come right to my lab's website at socialcogdev.com. So socialcogdev.com, socialcogdev.com. And there'll be a link in the upper right to contact us, and we'll get right back to you and talk about how this all works.
And I mean, the doors are open. This is not like September. This is as we speak.
Absolutely. Yeah. This coming year is our sort of primary year where we're hoping for this new project to collect most of the data, from about 12 to 15 months starting now for the next 12 to 15 months. And then the final year of the project will be more gathering the data together, analyzing it, looking across our 5 sites and all of that action. So a lot going on in the next year, but even more generally than that, we're always looking to build more connections to the community. I mean, I've been here 5 years now, raising a family here, really think of myself as part of the community and want to build those connections to whatever extent I can. I want to break down that sort of town-gown divide and really make more positive connections between aspects of the Yale community and the broader New Haven community.
And you I appreciate you saying that. And you mentioned there would be a number of reasons for us to chat, even if this grant had not been provided. So share about that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think some of the things we've talked about in the past is I've been involved for a long time and research on many areas that relate to things like stereotyping and prejudice. So I've done a lot of research on implicit bias and where that develops, where that comes from, how that arises in children. We've also done a lot of research. My team and my many really amazing collaborators have done research in India and Brazil and South Africa, looking at also Germany, the United Kingdom, looking at the kind of emergence of thinking about groups and the emergence of things like prejudice and stereotyping. We're doing a lot of research now looking at how children's kind of credulity, what do children believe from different sources? So you can almost think about it as relating to all this worry about fake news. What kinds of information sources do children tend to rely on?
Good point,
and really trying to think of children as active consumers of information. I mean, it's not enough to think of them as just passive recipients of information from their parents or from the environment or teachers. They're out there making choices, what shows to watch, what comics to read, where to go, who to talk to. So we're trying to understand that more active side as well.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's that open, if not totally open invitation, but there's the desire to work in selected ways with community groups and partners and schools.
Absolutely. So we're always looking to enroll more families, more children in our different areas of research, but also to give back. So when we work with schools, I often try to go, if I can speak with any group from the children themselves, to talk just a little bit about developmental science and how cool it is to think about the changing child's mind, to PTA or parent groups, to teachers themselves, and just sort of try to share some of the knowledge that not necessarily just me, but that my broader field has developed over the last decade or two.
So I know, for example, the New Haven Parent Teachers Association, they meet monthly. If they wanted to have a guest speaker from your organization come,
absolutely.
Just as an example.
Absolutely.
Or the early child learning centers, or whatever the case might be. I mentioned this year because, and you referenced town gown. Perhaps it might be forever that there might be a perception. We're talking a lot about perceptions during the show, but also how your perceptions kind of structure your behavior. Yale versus what the other might be. That tension might be there, but I really kind of admire and respect the fact that you're extending the definition, extending the identity, that we may still be in New Haven Town or Yale Town or whatever we want to call it, but there may be something that might even supersede our tax status or our IRS status or our citizenship status even.
I certainly hope so. That's I think the great hope that we have, is that there are things that can supersede those potential divisions. Certainly in our very divided country now, that's something I think on lots of our minds these days. What are there things which can kind of bridge some of these divides?
And so in terms of your research, how did you again, you can't predict what your outcome is going to be, but you have to persuade the funders that there's that this investment, there might be a return on this investment. How are you going to quantify or substantiate the return on the investment, the outcome being? And it might be a negative outcome. You might, if correct me if I'm wrong, but research is supposed to be open-ended. You may say we can't change it. After we've done this research, and it's a better minds, or but I'm just, I make that bad joke, but just how are you kind of, how do you, once the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing?
So I guess that one might say there are these kind of near-term goals, and the first, that's to kind of characterize these different groups of children in these different regions of the United States and from these different backgrounds. How are they kind of intuitively, naturally, spontaneously thinking about race and gender as 4- and 5-year-olds? One other hope, though, we're very committed as a team to these recent movements in psychology and other sciences that are sometimes called open science. The idea that we need to make everything more transparent so that someone else can come and evaluate what we did. And if they think it's great, all the better. If they disagree, they can really find out exactly what they disagree about. So some of the things we're doing is ultimately we'll be posting all of our material. So all of the different kind of assessments that we've developed for this project, they'll be freely available online so that other researchers, maybe you're a researcher in another part of the US where you have a really interesting group of, interesting population there and really interesting, dynamics. You can take our whole set of measures and basically add your data to our broader project. So that's one of the near-term goals, is to really just create this open possibility and the possibility for a lot more researchers to get involved, including maybe researchers coming from smaller institutions who don't have the resources to get a whole, large federal grant or to build a big team of collaborators, but can take our products right off the shelf for free and use them. So that's one of the things. Longer term, I guess it would come back to what we talked about before, about trying to identify sort of what are things that predict or kind of correlate with more versus less, say, negativity towards members of other racial groups, for example. If we can identify, so some of the things we're really interested in are, for example, does the diversity of the sort of friendship network of the parents, so, the friends that are being brought, that might be at the house, or you might go out to a park in the barbecue, who are the people that the child is interacting with in those environments? And our hope, and we have some reason to think that it's quite plausible that if you're a child growing up with a more diverse network of people around you, that actually can be some kind of protective. Because if you think about it, you're getting direct evidence against some forms of stereotypes. You're seeing all kinds of people who might look different, but who are treated like family, who are brought into your home as guests, who are warm, who play with you, who interact with you. And so, in a sense, that can be providing counter evidence to just learning this kind of impersonal stereotype.
That's profound. And what flashed through my mind was our I call 145th the current occupier of the White House going to Montana, which is not to give one of his rallies. So that, in your sense, that was kind of a deliberate selection of a location.
Absolutely. Well, I think I don't like to describe our current president as having so many gifts, but one might say that one of his gifts is he is really brilliant at using the language of division. So this is it's a bad thing, but it is something he's clearly very good at. I mean, I started out at the very beginning talking about this kind of natural human tendency to look for your people, to look for your tribe. Well, his constant drumbeat is us and them, is they are coming to take from us. We are arrayed against them. They are the enemy. They are criminals. They are rapists. They are uneducated. They are only taking. Notice this language is all about ramping up this tendency towards division. And he's using it very effectively to rally people to that cause. But it's exceedingly unfortunate because it's really preying on, I think, some really dangerous aspects of human psychology. And frankly, at times I find it really quite terrifying, the extent to which this is his sort of modus operandi. He's like, the way in which he interacts in politics is to create these divisions and use them for his own political gain.
Well, kudos for you, because we all have to be, in my mind, historical agents at some level, and you're certainly making history, creating history. And some people would say, again, trying to condition people's perception, but this seems to be a volatile world of multi influences, good and bad. I guess from a theological standpoint, we can just go back to the light and darkness, but kind of thing. In terms of your lab, just as we kind of conclude, and I want to give you the last word. Are there other labs in the United States? You mentioned the transparency and the translation, people having be able to access it, just even if you're a regular consumer. But is this is your lab kind of unique? Is it part of a consortium? Is it growing? I mean, you hear so much about academic centers of investigation across the board. I was just curious on the broad scale from the academic world. Are you guys?
So there's not really a sort of a formal network of labs, but I would say I have a lot of labs with a lot of other researchers, really, who are the kind of heads of these different labs that are people with that you might think of as kind of my kindred spirits, people who approach these things in similar ways. And of course, this is science. It doesn't mean we always agree. Sometimes we have, I don't want to use the word fight, but we might argue and like have different, theoretical views or, have findings that don't sit nicely together, but we know we're in it together and with the same kind of long-term goals of really trying to understand the developing mind. And indeed, the labs that I mentioned as part of this research project I'm engaged in now, this is just, if I can very quickly mention their names.
Sure,
it's
absolutely,
Christina
please.
Olson, who's a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, Sarah Gaither, who's a professor at Duke, Mei Ling Hallam at Cal State University of Long Beach, and Kristen Packer, who's at the University of Hawaii. And these are all researchers who are doing really fascinating work on related topics. Each one has their own little area of interest. Christina Olson is also doing a lot of work with gender development in other ways, including what you might call atypical gender development, looking at the development of kind of gender non-conforming or transgender kids. Sarah Gaither has done a lot of work looking at biracial or multiracial identity, and she really likes to point out the biggest single demographic in the United States now is multiracial.
Yes.
And so things are really changing.
So-called blended family.
Exactly.
Yes.
And this, from all the kinds of questions we've talked about, raises a whole host of new questions.
That's right.
Who do you identify with as a, say, biracial child? How do you approach these questions of identity of us and them when you are yourself, in this sense, blended? So anyway, these are all just a really wonderful group of kind of researchers that I feel really lucky to get to work with.
And to your point that the Duchess, of course, was very clear about how she was going to, Merkel, how she was going to, I forget her name, actual name, but recently married, how she was going to identify herself as not black, but biracial.
That's right.
Although the press would not let that go, but nonetheless, if you saw the wedding, there certainly were the programming had a certain flair that was not
not typical for that.
That represented part of her mother, or more of her mother than her father. But I won't go there. I mean, I'm just saying, you can say one thing, but your actions sometimes. Yes. But at any rate, oh boy, I lost my thought. The people that you referenced, because for the website and additional promotion of this opportunity, should we go to their name? Should we go to their institutions? How can we link? Are they?
Maybe what I can try to do is add a little something to my website where it's easy to find them. Add a little something about this project. But I think really the easiest way is if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I can very easily put you in touch with all of them. They're also very easy to find them. If you did get their names, you can very quickly find them. They all have a web presence and mostly are on Twitter and places like that as well.
Perfect, because we tend to forget, although we're focusing on recruiting young people for and families here for New Haven, but because the show can be listened to anywhere in the world, and I will actually send out the link to people in the cities you've referenced as well as to other cities. So just to kind of make it happen. This is great. Again, you listen to the Tom Ficklin Show. We're kind of winding up, and Yarrow Dunham is with us, the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. What's kind of whirling through your mind, because you've shared some really nuggets of inspiration with us as well as commitment, and we know how people can reach you. But it's just so important to have you and your colleagues here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, oftentimes when people hear what I study, they go immediately to the negative. Oh my God, are you showing that 4-year-olds are racist, or that these things are innate, or these things are inevitable? And sometimes we are finding evidence consistent with that. But for me, working with children always brings back this very hopeful side, because I do think that fundamentally children are very open-minded, in many ways much more open-minded than we are as adults. They're looking to us to try to understand, and that means there's a real opportunity to communicate a different set of values to them, a more inclusive, a more kind of open and less rigid set of values. So I do really see childhood as this really kind of amazing window into both the potential dark sides, but also the really much more positive sides of the human spirit. And so that's one of the things that keeps me coming back, keeps me coming into the lab to work with children.
Good. Is it reductionist to just even say, and not to kind of reduce the importance and the complexity and I won't say technology, but just the thought that you've given in terms of the research design, but in terms of nature versus nurture. Is that what you're trying to explicate or decipher?
I mean, the way I think about it is we are evolved creatures. I believe in the theory of evolution, that we evolved to have certain sort of propensities, but how those play out is extremely variable. I mean, one of the things that makes our species different from pretty much all other species is that we can form permanent settlements, build culture, really in any part of the world across such an incredible amount of environmental variation. So what really makes our species unique is our flexibility, our ability to adapt to all kinds of different environments, not over like historic time, but just over single, lifetimes. And so there are we need to understand what nature provides us with. And I think my belief is it provides us with some general sense of looking for us and them, but that can itself play out in lots of ways. It can play out in much more and much less rigid ways. And what we need to do is figure out within the bounds of what our endowment, our natural endowment has provided us for, figure out how to steer things in more positive directions.
Perfect. Again, we're kind of winding up, and that I was about to say I would give you the last word, but that's really a lovely last word. Do you want to have an addendum last word as we kind of sign off?
I don't think so. It's been great to be here again. If you want to reach out, socialcogdev.com. Would love to hear from any of you.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone. And Yarrow, thank you as well. It's been a pleasure. This is your second time, back, and you were here with Tom Krattenmaker last time, but we're going to have you back, or some of your colleagues, and also some of the folks you've referenced in the other cities. They could call in, and they could join us in the discussion if you so choose. This is something that I don't want to get to a one-off. This is really important. So I appreciate your kind of helping us launch it and get the word out. And congratulations to you for receiving the award.
Thank you.
And what's your daughter's name as we kind of wind down?
Her name is Elise.
Elise, this show is dedicated to you and your colleagues and your cohort. And your generation. We love you, we respect you, and we want you to kind of grow up to be healthy, sound, and faithful in whatever endeavor you engage.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, lights, camera, action, I'm ready to go. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Yeah, this is my road, lights, camera, action, I'm ready to go. Way too long, we faced them storms, now you gon' face the dawn you waited for. I said from night to dawn, I right my wrongs alone. In competition with warnings, ice galore. Now I'm running toward them highlights, I'm finished being a quitter. But little by little, they joking, telling some riddles. Now I'm in my section, ain't willing to give up. Though you getting knocked down, but you gotta get up. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, lights, camera, action, I'm ready.